Hey, Saretsky here. Welcome back to the show. I want to touch on two news article headlines that came out in the same week. The first one that came out was housing starts. Housing starts are booming in Canada. They just hit a 13-month high unexpectedly. And the Bloomberg article goes on to say that this is adding evidence of the construction momentum that's picking up as borrowing costs start to fall. And amid billions in new loans and tax breaks from the federal government, it's working. The plan is working. You had Sean Fraser, the housing minister, also promote the sudden jump in housing starts. All of a sudden, we got a 13-month housing starts. The real estate cycle is over. We're back to building. Steve, you've been talking about on this channel that, we're going to see housing starts roll off over the next 18 to 24 months. You said there's bad times ahead. Clearly, you are wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. And it's funny, right? Because you're like, wow, well, housing started. What the heck's going on here, guys? Let's try to unpack this. Because in the same week, you had an article, Stats Canada, coming out from the Globe and Mail, showing that Canada's on track to hit about 240 real estate insolvencies this year. And that would be the highest since 2009, just after the global financial crisis. So we've got real estate insolvencies the highest since higher than 2009. And this doesn't include the plethora of projects that have been forced into receivership. Because keep in mind, there's two ways that you can measure developers basically going more or less up, belly up. It's through an insolvency, basically bankruptcy, where you basically raise your hands and say, I'm done. I'm going to wipe my slate clean, take whatever I've got, I'm out, and you basically just kick rocks. The other one is where the lender says, hey, listen, buddy, you're behind on your payments, you owe me, this thing ain't going where, there's clearly no exit strategy. I then go to the courts, I put the courts assign a receiver to basically then take the assets and start selling them off for them into the open market. So that isn't counted in your insolvency stats, but in reality, that's how a lot of real estate developments actually end up proceeding, is they don't actually necessarily go through insolvency, they actually go through receivership, where again, they're basically forced, someone gets assigned to sell off those assets. So how do you kind of square these two? How do you square, the highest insolvency in over 15 years versus all of a sudden you got housing starts taking off? Housing starts in Canada are predominantly a story today of condos and rental apartment buildings, right? We don't build new single-family houses, right? I live in Vancouver here. The cost to build a single-family house in the city of Vancouver, okay, is minimum is about $600 a square foot. So if you go out there, pick up the phone and say, I'm going to call, I don't want to build a new house in Kitsilano, you're at least $600 a foot, okay? So 6 times 3, 3,000 square feet, $1.8 million just for the house, not including the dirt. So that's why people basically don't build single-family houses anymore. We're adding 1.2 million people a year into the country, and so what we're doing, we're building condos. And so housing starts are basically predominantly multifamily. And multifamily takes years and years and years just to get to the housing start process, because there's this long and variable lag to get to a housing start. Okay, so first and foremost, you go out there, you acquire the dirt, you go through some redevelopment, rezoning processes that can take 2 to 3 years with environmental studies, dealing with the city, going back for second and third readings to tweak your building based on public feedback. So this can take at least 2 to 3 years to get through that process. Then you launch your presentation center. You got to sell about 60% of your building to the market in order to obtain financing from the bank to begin the construction. So in order for you to put the hole in the ground, you got to typically sell at least 60% of the building. That can take another year to get 60% of the sales. So the housing starts tell you what happened, over the last 2, 3, 4 years. Okay. So when we see, housing starts at the levels they are, this is indicative of the market conditions we had several years ago. What in reality is in real time is permits. And so when you look at what's happening on the permit side, again, the permit side, so basically, a building permit, it comes after you've sold your pre-sale. So the number one leading indicator in reality, the number one leading indicator is actually pre-sales. So pre-sales are the leading indicator that you want to watch. Pre-sales in the GTA just hit a 27-year low through the first half of this year. So through the first half of this year, the GTA new pre-sale home sales are at 27-year lows. Here in Greater Vancouver, you're at 10-year lows. You're at 10-year lows in pre-construction home sales. Pre-construction home sales, again, you got to obtain 60% of the sales need to be pre-sold, and just in order to get the financing to start, to get the building permit to then dig the hole and then get your foundation poured, which then becomes a housing start. So this is the long variable lag. I have to laugh when these politicians talk about their great programs that they're creating. One of the great charts, really just to kind of illustrate this, is if you look at what's happening, again, the Toronto new home sales versus condo starts, you can see new condo sales lead. They lead condo starts. So there's this sort of 18-month lag, basically, and you can see clearly where condo starts are going to be going. Again, over the next 18 months, they're going nowhere but down, and that's the same thing in Vancouver. It's the same thing in a lot of these major metros. I think Alberta, again, probably being the sole outlier where I think you'll see housing starts continue to rise. So keep that in mind. We talk about these housing accelerator funds. I think that this program, while it's well-intentioned, is actually turning out to be this large heist that we've talked about. The heist being that the federal government has started cutting checks for all these municipalities that have been changing their zoning. So they've been freeing up all this land to be built into high-rise towers. But what they've basically been doing is they've been jacking up their development fees to offset and basically curtail the development. And so they said, well, look, feds, we just changed the zoning. Give us the money. And then as soon as they get the money, they go and they change and raise their permit and tax fees to basically kill any sort of viability of these projects, knowing that they're not going to get built. But they got the check, so who cares? And so what we've seen, for example, in the city of Burnaby, is they raised the development fees on a condo building by $50,000 per unit. It's not $50,000 total. They raised them. They raised them by $50,000. Okay, we've seen in the district of North Vancouver, not far from where I live. They've proposed and they're going to push it through that $80,000 increase. And again, not an $80,000 total, but an $80,000 increase to the cost of a permit for a single family home in the district of North Vancouver. That, in my opinion, is a heist. There was a great thread that was put out by one of my good local follows here in Vancouver, Bryn Davidson. He's a local sort of architect, small builder. Does a lot of work on laneway homes in Vancouver. And he really just he laid it all out. He laid out all the math, and he was like, listen, back in 2010, I was building laneway homes for about $300,000. Today, the same laneway houses the same laneway house, $600,000. So it went from $300,000 to $600,000 over the last 14 years in the city of Vancouver. Again, $600,000 for basically a 700 square foot laneway house in the city of Vancouver. And so you can see why the cost of building and the cost of real estate is so expensive in some of these major metropolitan cities. Government taxes and fees that make up the huge, massive chunk of these developers' pro formas. To the point where about 30% of the cost of a new home is basically just government fees and taxes. And you say, well, wow, that's ridiculous. Why don't they just lower the fees and taxes? Well, why don't they? I mean, they should. The reality is that what they need to do is that these cities are desperate for tax revenues. There's a lot of political pushback by raising people's annual property taxes on their homes, right? You think about all these poor seniors, these people, they can't afford it. We're going to kick them out of their house if we raise property taxes too much. That's not politically popular. So what they do is they keep your property taxes artificially low, and they basically just pass on the rev growth the revenue cost onto the developers, and because it's pretty easy to say, well, what homeowner or voter, what voter is actually well aware of what the developers are paying on their development fees? It's just much easier to rip the developers off and say, well, hey, it's a greedy real estate developer, he can afford it. And so what happens is they can't afford it in today's market, so nothing gets built, and then you kind of go through this continuous shortage, chronic undersupply of housing. And again, I don't think we're going to have a undersupply of housing over the next 12 to 18 months because, we can see interest rates have gone up. We've got some excess supply coming to the market, But as the real estate cycle normalizes, as rates kind of filter back out, as you get through this real estate cycle, your next up cycle, you'll see the shortage again. It'll reemerge in 4 or 5 years, as it typically always does. Because we kind of go round and round in circles. And so the one thing I would kind of leave you with, is, and again, I have these conversations all the time with, developers, lenders. This is what I do day to day. And so you see it when you're in the industry, you kind of see how warped it all is, and the sort of the smoke and the mirrors that the government tells you or whatever. But the reality is that governments, by taking about 30% of the cost of a new home, and that continues to go up, right? That continues to push higher. They set a floor on the market, okay? So they take such a large chunk of the developer's pro forma that the developer says, well, listen, I can't build. I can't even sell this. I can't build it. If I want to make no money, for example, I can't sell this for less than $1,300. I'm giving you like real life examples in Vancouver. I can't sell this project for less than $1,400 a foot. That's my break even after all I factor in the excessive costs of developing now, all the government fees and taxes. My break even is $1,400 a foot. Obviously, I'm doing this for free. I'm not a charity. I make money, so I got to sell it at $1,600 a foot. And if I can't get $1,600 a foot, I don't build. And so what happens then is the developer now needs to achieve this really high price. They need to achieve this $1,600 a foot, but the resale market is at about $1,100 a foot. So you got this massive gap that continues to widen. And so, and especially if you see now the resale market's coming down a bit, let's say it goes from $1,100 a foot to $1,000 a foot, well, all of a sudden it makes even less sense for someone to go and buy the $1,600 a foot. And again, remember, the developer can't take that cost down because the construction costs aren't really coming down. Like the plumber's not taking less money. The electrician's not taking less money. The cost of the commodity, it moves a little bit, but and the government fees and taxes don't come down. They actually continue to go up. And so they can't really move that pro forma a lot. So what happens is the construction cycle just turns off. And that's what I basically just walked you all through, is that first what happens is pre-sales, new home sales fall off a cliff. And because people don't want to say, if I can pay $1,100 a foot, why would I pay $1,600 a foot? So the pre-sales fall off a cliff. So nothing gets built. And so basically no new supply comes to the market over the next 3, 4, 5 years. That then creates the shortage, which allows the next boom, which allows basically the resale market has to close the gap. The resale has to close the gap with the cost of new construction. AKA, if it's $1,100 a foot today, that's going to start going back up. That's going to get to $1,200, $1,300 a foot, where the gap now between new and old is much, much narrower, where people start to say, well, hey, you know what? Maybe I would like some new construction for $1,600 a foot. If I'm buying, 20-year-old stuff for $1,300 a foot, why don't I pay a little bit more and get a brand new product in 3 years? Maybe I'll take that gamble. So that has to make sense. And so again, by the government's laying on all these fees and taxes, they artificially put a minimum cost to build new product, which ultimately suppresses the ability to oversupply or bring new supply to market. And so This is the real world racket that I live in, and so I always find it interesting to hear politicians talk about new housing, how they're going to bring it on, but nobody wants to lower the fees, and so we're just going to change zoning and pretend like we're doing something, and we go around and around and around and around. So again, housing starts significantly lagging. Any politician that is promoting housing starts, they lag. Permits are a little bit better, but again, permits still lag a little bit. Your leading indicator is new home sales. And so when you look at new home sales and you see what's happening in the real estate insolvency space, you see what's happening all across the board. Real estate insolvencies are going to continue to rise. Developments are going to continue to shut their doors. New housing is going to continue to move lower. The number of new units that are going to be coming to market continue to move lower. And you'll probably see, I think, more job losses coming in the construction sector, which employs about 8% of the Canadian labor force. So we'll see. As always, hope that helped, and we'll see you next week.